The F-16 Fighting Falcon disappeared from radar at 3:47 hours, somewhere over the mountainous terrain of contested airspace. Search and rescue teams found the wreckage 3 days later, twisted metal scattered across a rocky outcrop, the ejection seat deployed, but no sign of the pilot. Major Kestrel Ghost, Navaro had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a burning aircraft that would fuel enemy propaganda for weeks. What the intelligence analysts didn't know was that Ghost had survived the crash with nothing but her sidearm, a survival kit, and 15 years of combat experience that her male counterparts had consistently underestimated. The same woman they'd nicknamed the librarian for her quiet demeanor and methodical approach was about to demonstrate why she'd earned more confirmed kills than any pilot in her squadron. The mountainous region stretched for hundreds of miles, honeycombed with caves and ancient tunnels that insurgent forces had converted into a labyrinthine network of hideouts and weapons caches. Satellite imagery showed at least 40 confirmed enemy positions, each one heavily fortified and connected by underground passages that made conventional assault nearly impossible. It was the kind of terrain where armies disappeared and special forces operations went to die. Ghost understood this landscape better than anyone realized. Before joining the Air Force, she'd spent summers hiking these very mountains with her geologist father, learning to read the terrain like a book. She knew which caves would echo footsteps, which rock formations provided natural cover, and how the wind patterns changed with altitude. This knowledge, combined with her pilot's understanding of tactical positioning and her sniper training from her early Army days, made her uniquely equipped for what was about to unfold. The first enemy patrol found her crashed aircraft on day 4. They celebrated, taking photographs with the wreckage and posting them online as proof of their victory against American air power. What they didn't realize was that Ghost was watching from a concealed position 200 meters away, studying their movements, counting their numbers, and cataloging their equipment through the scope of a rifle she'd taken from her first kill. The propaganda videos showed confident fighters posing with twisted metal, their faces uncovered, their weapons displayed proudly. They spoke of shooting down the American pilot, of proving their superiority against the world's most advanced military. The footage went viral, shared across social media platforms, and broadcast on international news channels as evidence of American vulnerability. But in the shadow of those mountains, something else was happening, something the cameras couldn't capture and the propagandists couldn't spin. One by one, the sentries were disappearing. Guards who left their posts for routine patrols simply never returned. Supply convoys arrived at empty outposts to find cold fires and abandoned weapons. The mountain, it seemed, had developed an appetite for insurgent fighters. The enemy leadership initially attributed these disappearances to desertion, a common problem in their ranks. They had no idea they were being hunted by a ghost who had transformed from prey into predator, using the very terrain they thought they controlled as her personal killing field. The mountains that had swallowed so many military operations were about to reveal their most dangerous secret. Sometimes the hunted becomes the hunter. The first confirmed kill happened on night 6. Specialist Ahmed Qasim was manning a forward observation post when he simply vanished. His radio went silent mid-transmission. His weapon was found propped against a rock as if he'd just stepped away, and his body was discovered 3 days later in a ravine 2 kilometers from his position. A single gunshot wound to the head, fired from extreme range with surgical precision. The insurgent commanders dismissed it as an accident, perhaps a rival faction settling old scores. But Ghost was just getting started. She'd spent 6 days learning their patrol routes, their communication patterns, their weaknesses. Every movement was calculated, every strike designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing her own exposure. Night 7 brought the second disappearance. Then Night 8 claimed 2 more. Each kill was different, sometimes a long-range shot from an impossible angle, sometimes close quarters work that left bodies arranged in ways that defied explanation. The victims were always found in locations that should have been unreachable, killed by someone who seemed to move through the mountains like smoke. The psychological warfare was intentional. Ghost understood that fear was a force multiplier, that uncertainty could paralyze an enemy more effectively than any direct assault. She left no calling cards, no signatures that might reveal her methods or location. She was a ghost in the truest sense, present only in the growing paranoia that began to consume the insurgent network. Radio chatter picked up by intelligence analysts revealed growing concern among enemy forces. "The American pilot is dead" became "The American pilot might be alive," which evolved into "Something is hunting us in the mountains." Discipline began to break down as fighters refused certain assignments, demanded additional backup for routine patrols, and jumped at shadows in the perpetual twilight of the deep valleys. By the second week, Ghost had eliminated 12 enemy combatants without sustaining so much as a scratch. She moved through the mountain network like water flowing downhill, always taking the path of least resistance while maintaining maximum lethality. Her Army sniper training served her well in the long-range engagements, while her pilot's spatial awareness helped her navigate the three-dimensional maze of ridges and valleys. The insurgents began changing their tactics, moving in larger groups, altering patrol routes daily, and maintaining constant radio contact. But Ghost adapted faster than they could react. She'd spent years in the cockpit making split-second tactical decisions at 500 miles per hour. Outmaneuvering foot soldiers was almost insultingly easy. Her reputation among the enemy grew with each kill, transforming from skepticism to grudging respect to outright terror. They called her Al-Shaba, the ghost, and spoke of her in whispers around their campfires. Some claimed she could walk through walls, others that she commanded the mountain spirits themselves. The truth was more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. She was simply better at their own game than they were. Command began receiving intelligence reports that painted an increasingly clear picture of what was happening in the mountains. Enemy communications were filled with references to the ghost pilot and desperate requests for reinforcements to deal with what they described as a supernatural threat. Morale among insurgent forces was collapsing as rumors spread faster than facts. But back at Falcon Base, the mood was somber. Ghost squadron mates held a memorial service on day 10, assuming she died in the crash. Her call sign was retired, her personal effects were packed for shipment home, and her name was added to the casualty reports that would eventually reach her family in New Mexico. Captain Rick "Cowboy" Morrison, who'd once joked that Ghost was too pretty for combat, delivered a eulogy that praised her dedication while carefully avoiding any mention of her actual combat record. The assembled pilots nodded solemnly, many of them secretly relieved that they'd no longer have to compete with someone whose kill ratio made them look incompetent by comparison. None of them understood that their memorial service was premature by several weeks. Ghost wasn't just alive. She was methodically dismantling an entire insurgent network using nothing but patience, precision, and a profound understanding of mountain warfare that she'd learned at her father's side 2 decades earlier. The mountains had taught her to think in geological time, to move with the patience of erosion and strike with the sudden violence of avalanches. Every lesson from her childhood hikes was now being applied to the deadliest game of hide-and-seek ever played in those ancient peaks. The insurgents' luck was about to get much worse. The turning point came on night 15, when Ghost discovered the main command bunker. Hidden in a natural cave system and reinforced with concrete and steel, it housed the regional leadership and served as the coordination center for operations across 3 provinces. Intelligence had been searching for this facility for months, but it was virtually invisible from the air and protected by multiple layers of security. Ghost found it by following a water source. Her father had taught her that mountain people always built near reliable water, and that springs often indicated larger cave systems beneath. She tracked a small stream uphill for 3 kilometers, noting how the water disappeared into what appeared to be solid rock. A closer inspection revealed a carefully camouflaged entrance large enough for vehicles. For 2 days, she observed the facility from multiple vantage points, mapping the security procedures and identifying key personnel. The insurgents had grown paranoid about her activities, but they still maintained predictable patterns around their most important installation. Guards changed shifts every 4 hours, supply convoys arrived before dawn, and communication antennas were repositioned twice daily. Most importantly, she identified the facility's greatest weakness: overconfidence. The leadership believed their location was undetectable, their security impenetrable. They'd grown complacent in their mountain fortress, never imagining that their hunter was already inside their perimeter. Ghost's attack began at 200 hours with the systematic elimination of perimeter guards. 5 sentries died in silence, each one taken down with precise knife work that left no time for warnings or radio calls. She moved through their positions like a professional dancer, each step choreographed to maintain perfect timing and spacing. The infiltration itself required skills she'd learned in 3 different military specialties. Her pilot training gave her spatial awareness in the dark corridors. Her sniper background provided the patience to wait for perfect shots, and her early combat engineering experience helped her navigate the facility's layout and identify structural weaknesses. Inside the command center, she discovered intelligence that would reshape the entire regional conflict. Maps showing planned attacks on civilian targets, communication logs revealing connections to international terrorist networks, and most importantly, detailed information about American prisoners being held in facilities throughout the mountain range. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. 3 American service members were being held less than 50 kilometers away, scheduled for execution in a propaganda video that would be released within 48 hours. Everything changed in that moment. Her mission evolved from survival and revenge to rescue and strategic disruption. Ghost had 46 hours to save 3 lives and prevent a propaganda victory that could influence American public opinion about the entire conflict. The prisoner facility sat in a valley so narrow that sunlight reached the ground for only 4 hours each day. Surrounded by sheer rock walls and accessible only through a single mountain pass, it was a natural fortress that had been enhanced with modern security systems and overlapping fields of fire. Intelligence estimates suggested it would require a full company of special forces operators to successfully assault. Ghost had different ideas about the definition of successful assault. Her reconnaissance revealed that the facility held not just the 3 Americans, but also 17 local nationals who'd been accused of collaborating with coalition forces. The prisoners were kept in a converted monastery that had been fortified with concrete barriers and razor wire, its ancient stone walls now bristling with modern weapons and surveillance equipment. The guards were different here, more professional, better trained, and significantly more paranoid about security. They'd heard the stories about the ghost in the mountains, and they weren't taking any chances. Patrols moved in groups of 4, radio checks occurred every 15 minutes, and perimeter lighting illuminated every possible approach route. But Ghost had spent 3 weeks learning to think like the mountains themselves, patient, implacable, and utterly relentless. She didn't need to assault the fortress. She needed to make the fortress come apart from within. The plan she developed was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Rather than attempting a direct rescue, she would turn the facility's own security against itself, creating chaos and confusion that would allow the prisoners to escape while she systematically eliminated their captors. It began with the water supply. The facility drew from a mountain spring that fed into storage tanks through a series of pipes and filtration systems. Ghost introduced a mild hallucinogenic compound, derived from a local plant her father had warned her about during their hiking expeditions, into the water system during the early morning hours when consumption would be highest. The effects began manifesting within 6 hours. Guards reported seeing movement in the shadows, hearing voices from empty rooms, and detecting threats that weren't there. Radio chatter became increasingly frantic as security teams responded to phantom contacts and false alarms. By nightfall, the facility was in chaos. Half the guards were experiencing mild psychosis, while the other half were exhausted from responding to constant false alarms. Command structure broke down as officers began doubting their own perceptions and questioning every report they received. Ghost struck during the shift change at midnight, when confusion was at its peak and guard positions were temporarily undermanned. She moved through the facility like a force of nature, eliminating sentries with ruthless efficiency while avoiding the areas where prisoners were held. The psychological impact was devastating. Guards found their colleagues dead in impossible locations, killed by someone who seemed to move through walls and disappear into solid stone. The rescue itself took less than 20 minutes. Ghost reached the prisoner compound, eliminated the remaining guards, and led the captives through an escape route she'd prepared during her earlier reconnaissance. The Americans, 2 soldiers and 1 airman, were weak but mobile, while the local nationals provided valuable intelligence about additional enemy positions throughout the valley. But the most important discovery came from the facility's communications center. Ghost found detailed plans for a coordinated attack on multiple coalition bases, scheduled to begin within 72 hours. The insurgents had been planning their largest offensive in years, and only her accidental discovery of their command structure had revealed the threat in time to prevent catastrophic losses. As she led the rescued prisoners through the mountain passes toward friendly territory, Ghost realized that her personal survival story had evolved into something much larger. She'd inadvertently uncovered and disrupted a strategic threat that could have changed the course of the entire conflict. The mountains had taught her patience and precision, but they'd also shown her the true scope of her capabilities. She wasn't just a pilot who'd survived a crash. She was a force multiplier who could single-handedly reshape the tactical landscape of an entire theater of operations. Behind her, the prisoner facility burned as explosive charges she'd planted in the ammunition depot detonated in a series of secondary explosions that could be seen from orbit. The message was unmistakable. The ghost was real, and she was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The journey to friendly territory took 4 days through terrain that tested every skill Ghost had acquired during her mountain odyssey. Leading 20 exhausted and traumatized prisoners through enemy-controlled valleys required constant vigilance and creative problem-solving that pushed her tactical abilities to their absolute limits. The rescued Americans provided crucial intelligence about insurgent operations they'd observed during their captivity, while the local nationals offered detailed knowledge of hidden routes and safe houses that had been established by resistance networks. Ghost found herself functioning as both military commander and expedition leader, making life-or-death decisions for a group that looked to her for salvation. Enemy response was swift and overwhelming. The destruction of their command center and prisoner facility had revealed the scope of Ghost's capabilities, transforming her from a nuisance into an existential threat that demanded immediate attention. Search teams combed the mountains with thermal imaging and aerial surveillance, while blocking forces attempted to seal off escape routes to coalition territory. But Ghost had spent a month learning to move through the mountains like smoke, and she taught her rescued companions to do the same. They traveled at night through valleys that didn't appear on maps, sheltered in caves that had hidden refugees for generations, and navigated by stars that her father had shown her during their childhood expeditions. The psychological warfare continued even during the escape. Ghost left false trails that led search teams into carefully prepared ambush sites, where remotely detonated explosives eliminated pursuers while creating the impression of a much larger force. Radio intercepts revealed growing paranoia among enemy commanders, who began to believe they were facing a full special operations team rather than a single pilot. On the third night, they encountered a patrol of 8 insurgents blocking a critical mountain pass. Ghost left the rescued prisoners in a concealed position and approached the enemy alone, using skills she'd refined during 3 weeks of solitary hunting. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes and ended with 8 more names added to her steadily growing kill count. The rescued airman, Technical Sergeant Maria Restrepo, watched through binoculars as Ghost eliminated the entire patrol with surgical precision. "Jesus Christ," she whispered to her companions. "That's not a pilot, that's a goddamn assassin." None of them understood that they were witnessing the culmination of a transformation that had begun with a crash landing and evolved through weeks of survival into something entirely new. Ghost hadn't just adapted to mountain warfare. She'd become its living embodiment, as natural and deadly as the avalanches that periodically reshaped the landscape. The final approach to coalition territory required crossing an open valley where aerial surveillance made concealment nearly impossible. Ghost solved the problem with characteristic creativity, timing their movement to coincide with a weather front that brought low clouds and limited visibility. They reached the forward operating base just as dawn broke over the mountains. The reunion at Forward Operating Base Kestrel was unlike anything the base personnel had ever witnessed. Ghost emerged from the mountain mist leading 20 rescued prisoners, her uniform torn and weathered but her bearing unmistakably military. The duty officer initially refused to believe that the quiet woman standing before him was the pilot they'd memorialized 3 weeks earlier. "Major Navaro," Captain Jennifer Walsh stammered, her hand frozen halfway to her sidearm. We held your funeral service." Ghost's response was characteristically direct. "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. I need immediate contact with intelligence and a secure line to higher command. We have a situation." The debriefing lasted 18 hours and involved personnel from every intelligence agency operating in the theater. Ghost's account of her survival and infiltration activities was initially met with skepticism, until the rescued prisoners corroborated details that no one could have fabricated. The intelligence she'd gathered painted a picture of insurgent capabilities that fundamentally altered coalition understanding of the threat. Most shocking was her documented kill count: 43 confirmed eliminations over 26 days, accomplished with minimal resources and no external support. The number represented more enemy casualties than some entire battalions had achieved during months of conventional operations. Colonel Marcus Webb, the base commander, struggled to reconcile the soft-spoken pilot he remembered with the tactical details being presented in the briefing room. "Major, are you telling me you single-handedly dismantled an entire insurgent network?" "No, sir," Ghost replied with characteristic precision. "I disrupted their operations and eliminated key personnel. The network still exists, but their command structure has been compromised and their operational capabilities have been significantly degraded." Her matter-of-fact delivery of extraordinary achievements became a source of fascination for the intelligence analysts. Here was an officer who'd accomplished what special operations teams struggled to achieve, yet she presented her actions as routine problem-solving rather than heroic accomplishment. The strategic implications were staggering. The planned insurgent offensive had been completely disrupted, saving potentially hundreds of coalition lives and preventing a propaganda victory that could have influenced public opinion back home. Intelligence gathered from the command center had already led to successful strikes on 3 additional enemy facilities. But perhaps most importantly, Ghost's actions had demonstrated that individual excellence could still be a decisive factor in modern warfare. In an era of technological supremacy and overwhelming firepower, one person with the right skills and determination had proven capable of changing the course of an entire conflict. The official reports would eventually classify her actions under several different categories: survival and evasion, direct action, reconnaissance, prisoner rescue, and psychological operations. But the simple truth was that no existing framework could adequately describe what she'd accomplished in those mountains. The Pentagon would spend months analyzing her methods, trying to understand how a single pilot had achieved results that entire divisions struggled to match. The transformation in how her colleagues viewed Ghost was immediate and profound. The same pilots who'd once dismissed her as the librarian now studied her every word, hoping to understand the source of capabilities they never suspected. Her quiet competence, once perceived as a lack of personality, was suddenly recognized as the hallmark of a professional who let actions speak louder than words. Captain Morrison, who delivered her eulogy just weeks earlier, found himself unable to make eye contact during the post-mission briefing. The contrast between his patronizing memorial speech and her actual achievements was too stark to ignore. "Ma'am," he finally managed, "I owe you an apology." Ghost's response was characteristically gracious. "No apology necessary, cowboy. You were working with the information available at the time." But the other pilots understood that something fundamental had changed in their squadron's dynamic. Ghost hadn't just survived an impossible situation, she'd thrived in it, demonstrating capabilities that forced everyone to reconsider their assumptions about military excellence. The promotion to lieutenant colonel came through within 48 hours, along with orders for a medal ceremony that would be attended by generals from 3 different services. Ghost accepted the recognition with the same quiet professionalism she'd always displayed, though those who knew her well could detect a subtle shift in her demeanor. She discovered something about herself in those mountains, something that went beyond military training or natural talent. Under extreme pressure, stripped of technological advantages and institutional support, she'd found reserves of capability that surprised even her. The experience had revealed not just what she could do, but who she really was underneath the modest exterior. The nickname Ghost took on new meaning throughout the base. What had once been a reference to her quiet presence now carried connotations of lethality and invisibility that made even hardened combat veterans speak with respect. She'd become a legend in her own time, though she seemed genuinely puzzled by the attention. "I just did what needed to be done," she told her squadron commander during a private conversation. "Anyone with similar training could have achieved comparable results." Colonel Webb shook his head. "Ma'am, I've been in this business for 25 years. What you accomplished wasn't just training, it was artistry." The truth was that Ghost had discovered the perfect intersection of her diverse skill sets, combining pilot training, sniper expertise, engineering knowledge, and childhood mountain experience into something entirely new. She'd become a force multiplier that operated according to principles that no manual had ever described. The mountains had been her university, and she'd graduated with honors in subjects that didn't have names. The intelligence community's analysis of Ghost's mountain campaign would eventually influence tactical doctrine for the next generation of special operations forces. Her integration of psychological warfare with direct action, her use of terrain as a force multiplier, and her ability to operate independently for extended periods became case studies in military academies around the world. But the immediate impact was felt throughout the theater of operations. Enemy communications intercepted after her rescue revealed the profound psychological effect her actions had achieved. References to Al-Shabaab appeared in intelligence reports for months afterward, as insurgent forces struggled to cope with the lingering fear that the Ghost might still be hunting in the mountains. Several enemy commanders were documented as refusing assignments in mountainous terrain, while others demanded overwhelming force protection for operations that would previously have been considered routine. The mere possibility of encountering the Ghost pilot had become a significant factor in enemy tactical planning. Colonel Sarah Martinez, the theater intelligence chief, briefed Pentagon officials on what she termed the Navaro effect, the strategic impact that a single individual's actions could have on an entire conflict. "What we're seeing here," she explained via secure video conference, "is how exceptional individual performance can create systemic change in enemy behavior patterns." The analysis revealed that Ghost's kill ratio, while impressive, was less important than her psychological impact. By operating in ways that defied conventional military logic, she'd created uncertainty and fear that paralyzed enemy decision-making processes. Her ability to appear anywhere, strike without warning, and disappear without trace had transformed the mountains from insurgent sanctuary into a source of anxiety. Military historians would later compare her campaign to legendary figures like Carlos Hathcock or Simo Häyhä, though her integration of multiple warfare disciplines created something unprecedented in military literature. She'd functioned simultaneously as sniper, pilot, intelligence operative, and psychological warfare specialist. The formal recommendations that emerged from the analysis called for new training programs that would attempt to replicate Ghost's multidisciplinary approach. But the Pentagon officials who reviewed her case understood that what she'd accomplished couldn't be easily duplicated or systematized. Some capabilities emerged from the unique intersection of individual talent, diverse training, and extraordinary circumstances. Ghost's Mountain campaign represented that rare convergence of factors that produced results far beyond the sum of their parts. The enemy networks she disrupted never fully recovered from her month-long campaign, and the intelligence she'd gathered continued to provide actionable information for years afterward. But perhaps more importantly, she demonstrated that individual excellence could still be decisive in an era of technological warfare. The mountains had tested her limits and revealed capabilities that even she hadn't known she possessed. In doing so, they'd created something new, a warrior whose legend would inspire future generations. The medal ceremony took place on a crisp morning that reminded Ghost of her childhood hikes with her father in these same mountains. As she stood at attention while the citation was read, she could see the peaks where she'd spent a month learning to hunt human prey with the patience and precision of a natural predator. The Distinguished Service Cross felt heavier than she'd expected as it was pinned to her uniform. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, but the formal language couldn't capture the reality of what she'd experienced in those caves and valleys. General Patricia Wang, who'd flown in from Washington specifically for the ceremony, delivered remarks that would be quoted in military leadership courses for decades afterward. "Major, excuse me, Lieutenant Colonel Navarro, has reminded us that our most sophisticated weapon systems are only as effective as the warriors who employ them. In an age of technological dominance, she's demonstrated that human excellence remains our decisive advantage." But Ghost's thoughts were elsewhere as the ceremony proceeded. She was thinking about her father, who taught her to read the mountains like a book, and how proud he would have been to see those childhood lessons applied in defense of freedom. She was remembering the faces of the prisoners she'd rescued, particularly Sergeant Restrepo, who'd looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and awe that she'd never forget. Most of all, she was thinking about the insurgents whose lives she'd taken, each one a human being with families and dreams, regardless of their allegiance. The mountains had taught her that survival sometimes required terrible choices, but they'd also shown her the weight that such choices carried. After the ceremony, she sought out the memorial wall where her own name had briefly appeared among the fallen. Someone had carefully removed the nameplate, but the outline was still visible in the weathered metal. It served as a reminder that death and glory often separated by margins thinner than mountain air. Captain Morrison approached as she stood before the memorial. "Colonel," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for showing us what real leadership looks like." Ghost turned to face her former squadron mate, nodding the genuine respect in his voice. "We all have different strengths, cowboy. Mine just happened to be what the situation required." It was a gracious response that deflected credit while acknowledging reality, exactly the kind of leadership approach that had made her so effective in those mountains. She understood that exceptional achievement carried the responsibility to inspire rather than intimidate, to build up rather than tear down. The mountains had taught her many lessons, but perhaps the most important was that true strength showed itself not in domination, but in the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you were capable of achieving. The legend of Ghost would spread far beyond that single theater of operations, inspiring a generation of military personnel who would carry her example into conflicts yet to be fought. But the woman herself remained grounded in the simple truth that had guided her through those desperate weeks. Sometimes the only way out is through. Years later, military academies would teach courses on the Navaro doctrine, the integration of survival skills, tactical patience, and psychological warfare that she'd pioneered during her month-long campaign. Special operations forces would study her methods, intelligence analysts would analyze her techniques, and historians would debate the strategic implications of her individual actions. But perhaps the most lasting impact of her mountain odyssey was simpler and more profound. She'd proven that one person, properly trained and sufficiently motivated, could still change the course of history. In an era when warfare seemed increasingly dominated by technology and overwhelming firepower, Ghost had demonstrated that individual excellence remained the ultimate force multiplier. The mountains had tested her and found her worthy, forging her into something new and dangerous and absolutely unstoppable. She'd entered those peaks as a pilot who'd survived a crash. She'd emerged as a warrior whose legend would outlive the conflict that created her. The Ghost pilot had become immortal in the way that only the finest military traditions can achieve, not through death, but through the inspiration her example would provide to future generations of warriors who would face their own impossible odds and remember that someone before them had found a way to prevail. In the end, the mountains had given her the greatest gift they could offer, the knowledge that no obstacle was truly insurmountable for someone willing to pay the price of excellence. That lesson would echo through military history long after the last echoes of gunfire had faded from those ancient peaks. The story of Major Kestrel Ghost, Navarro had become something larger than any individual achievement. It had become proof that heroes still walked among us, wearing the quiet dignity of those who serve without seeking glory and triumph, without losing their humanity. And somewhere in those mountains, the wind still whispered her call sign through the valleys where she'd hunted her enemies and rescued her comrades, ensuring that future generations would remember the pilot who disappeared into legend and emerged as something far greater than she'd ever imagined possible.